Hello, and now we return to a subject I've dealt with before at a lower level, and it's how the mind makes it possible to create and identify different language systems. So here's an overview to the talk, and it's a talk that I gave, or a version of this, to the bilingual reading group at Edinburgh University a few days ago. First I'll begin, as always, with an introduction, and then I'll look at the language concept from two very different basic perspectives. I will then continue to talk about the concept, but only in terms of the mind, and I want to look at language not just from a point of view of a linguist or psycholinguist. I want to look at it from the point of view of a cognitive scientist, in other words, language in the mind as a whole. And that's, of course, a special feature of the modular cognition framework, which you probably will be aware of if you watched any of these series. I will try to explain the various ideas that I will have presented by then at point 5, using the concrete example of a Spanish word. And then I'll have a reflection. It will be a reflection not so much about points 2 and 5, but about something I brought up in the introduction. Okay, let's begin with the introduction. And the question is, what is language? What is a language? What a language is? How do you tell one from the other? Are some, are any of them in some way good or bad? These are very general questions. It's one of those questions which you think, well, of course, everyone knows what a language is, and we all know what different languages are, but of course we're going to look at this in a particular context, and we'll find it's not so easy as all that. So, language in general and a language are vague concepts. When you try to pin them down in a rigorous fashion, they get very, very slippery. And they're open to multiple interpretations. Many of them are pre-scientific, they're not rigorous, and some of these are ideological in nature. So we have to know exactly within what framework we're talking about. Some clarity is achievable, and I'm interested in talking about it in a more scientific manner, and irrespective of any ideological commitments. But first we need to establish a basic perspective within which coherent discussions can be held. And what do I mean by a basic perspective? I mean a choice of two, and I'll get to those in a second. But we need to do more than that. We need an additional measure, something to narrow it down even further and introduce more rigour and more coherence into the discussion, and that is, we need some kind of special theoretical framework, and no prizes for guessing which one I'm going to be using. Right, so going back to the question of the basic perspectives, so two directions in which we need to look to find answers to these questions. One direction is outside, that's to say outside in the outside world, and that's the realm of the sociologist. The other option is to look inside in the mind, right? In the mind. And I'm talking specifically not about the brain but the mind, so I'm talking about the psychological perspective. And this gives us two very different versions to answering those questions, and any discussion about what the status of language is. So if we're going to talk within the same perspective, which is the only thing we can do if we want to have a decent conversation with someone, we have to know which of these two directions we are going in. So if you look outside in the outside direction, we are going to be talking about what language is and what languages are out there, right? What happens in society when we talk about language. And if we talk about inside, of course, we're interested in what language is in here. How does it figure in the mind? And if you're a neuroscientist, of course, you will say also in the brain. If you look at the sociological definition first, we'll note that some say that language is, and this is a very plausible claim, I think, from a sociological point of view, that language is a socio-cultural construct, right? In other words, it's not something that exists without human beings. It has to have human beings, and it has to have human beings interacting together in social groups. So people either tacitly or actively construct a particular view of language, and when they talk amongst each other, they all know what language is. But it's something that you have to learn. Each individual growing up in a society has to learn this at some point, maybe at primary school level, maybe earlier, but it is not. It's not something that is in your head all from the word go. You have to learn it, right? And it's constructed in that sense. This second claim came across recently in two talks quite recently, and that is, and this is a pretty controversial claim, I suppose, but it's very popular at the moment in some circles, and that is that language is actually a toxic concept. That's a curious thing to call a language, but more specifically, it's toxic because it's neo-colonialist. And why is it neo-colonialist? It's because as I see it, it's used to suppress people. It's used by one group to suppress another. And it's quite easy to see if you look, for example, at the history of language in South Africa, where firstly, when the Afrikaners were the dominant group, Afrikaans was the dominant language, and it had the effect of being requiring people to interact amongst each other in Afrikaans and not in the language perhaps that they were born to speak. And when the British took over, then English became the dominant language, and Afrikaans was then banned, and it only became legal again in the 1930s, I believe, and gradually it took over again and became, at least alongside English, the official language of South Africa. And most of the non-white community in South Africa, in fact, are Afrikaans speakers. So this kind of effect of languages which is a sort of weaponized use, makes people regard language, or some people regard language as neo-colonialist, and they even suggest that it should be dropped altogether. I'm more interested in how these things figure in the mind, in cognitive psychological terms, and I want to make a parallel claim to claim one. That's the socio-cultural construct claim, and look for a similar kind of claim when you're talking about language in the mind. And for me, language is a conceptual construct, and that is indeed the understanding of some linguists, and indeed within the modular cognition framework it's completely accepted. So language is a conceptual construct, which means that it has a specific status in the mind. Now notice that with regard to both the sociological and the psychological conceptualizations of language, language in general obviously is logically prior to actually deciding what a particular language is. You have to have a concept of language first, clearly, before individual languages can be constructed. That should be fairly straightforward. So language is represented as a meaning in our minds, and that means it's a conceptual representation, and it's created and stored in an individual's conceptual system. What is the conceptual system? Well, some of you will be familiar with this and will know that it's a system that creates and activates abstract meanings. It's a special system which has this particular function in our mind. So only when we have this language concept in our minds can separate languages, separate dialects, separate varieties, separate accents, any of these categories which are associated with language, only then can we start distinguishing them, we can identify them, recognize them, we can describe them, and if we're linguists we can associate them with a whole set of particular structural linguistic features. So first we have a notion of language, then we have to have a notion of, let's say, the Afrikaans language, and then we can get down to describing what its linguistic structural features are. But what, let's say, for the sake of argument, you don't have any language concept in your conceptual system? What if you don't have any language concept at all, right? You don't know what a language is. Does that mean you can never learn what we call a language? Well, of course not, because given the relevant exposure, an individual can still acquire linguistic systems, whatever you like to call them, whatever label you like to use, without necessarily having a concept of language, let alone the concept of separate languages. 2-year-olds, of course, are in that situation. A 2-year-old just is exposed to a particular language or languages and acquires them without any reflection on what language is or what individual languages. Of course, multilingual children learn very quickly to distinguish between different languages, so they get an idea of language quite early on. But the question now is, how can you provide coherence, detail and substance to explaining such psychological claims concerning the concept of language and about any number of different languages sitting beside one another in your head and not causing complete chaos? This is a question, as I say, I've talked about before, but I'm going to talk about it again. Thus far in this presentation we've been talking in rather general terms, I think you will agree, but we need to get down to something very much more specific because we want to introduce more rigour into the discussion. So in other words, you need some extra stuff, right? And what is the stuff you need? You need an account of linguistic representations, clearly. You need to know something about what linguists are interested in, linguistic systems and language structure. And you need to know as a psycholinguist how they're created and how they're processed, but this is simply not enough. I mean, it may be enough if you're a psycholinguist doing very specific research into a very specific topic, but ultimately it's not enough, right? You need to have a prior account of how any kind of cognitive representation is created and stored and handled online, because languages exist in the mind along with other things, right? And you need to know if there's any interaction and if there's any similarity between the way language and other things are processed and stored. You need to have this if you have to have a handle on how the mind handles things in general, but at a level of detail. And to explain this in detail, surprise, surprise, I will be applying the modular cognition framework. For those of you, an apology, I do have a customary warning which I'm going to repeat, and that is to remind you that mind systems and brain systems are related, but they are different things, right? So when we describe a mind system, it's more abstract, and we can indulge ourselves being at a more abstract level with boxes and diagrams and things like that, which of course are not in the physical brain. So it's relatively nice and neat, and relatively is the active term here. It's not necessarily nice and neat in general, but it is relatively nice and neat compared with when you're talking about the brain and how, for example, a visual system, an auditory system, a language system, whatever, is instantiated in the human brain, and then you've got a lot of level of specific detail which requires a different perspective. But any cognitive system, any system, knowledge system, whether you're talking about the mind or the brain, will have three things in common, right? They may differ in various ways, but they will have three things in common, right? They will have one, a unique set of processing principles. In other words, if you're talking about human vision, you're talking about the principles of human vision which are unique and not like principles of, let's say, audition or olfaction or conceptual systems. They are there to create and handle and process visual representations. And these principles are supplied as part of our biological inheritance, so they're part of our DNA. And we grow up with these things from the start, so that we acquire vision as humans. So human vision, the principles of human vision, of course, will differ from lizard vision or crow vision or bonobo vision. They'll all be different because they are part of our human system, and they are part of our biological inheritance. Then the second thing we need is a unique set of processing principles, and these processing principles we can describe in terms of a little box there. In the brain, of course, it's more complicated, but there it is, a principle, processing principles where which create representations which are stored in a particular place, right? They're not put into a one big box along with everything else, because they are specific to that system. And finally, the third thing we need is a way of connecting systems, right? This goes for the brain as well as cognition in psychological terms, is what we're using now. You need a way of connecting them, because they don't exist in limbo. They have to be used to solve various tasks. We are multitasking all the time, and we engage several systems for a particular task, and we need to be able to have these systems in our head interacting and collaborating in order to help us do that. And they do this via the interfaces. There they are, and very often systems are multiply connected with lots of other systems at the same time. So this is just a simplified picture. And what do these interfaces do? What is their function? Their function is to make associations, so that you associate, for example, a visual image, a visual representation, if you like, with a conceptual representation. You can, with a meaning, so that when you see something, you have a concept activated, which tells you, as it were, what it is. It identifies it for you. And you do this via the interface between the visual system and the conceptual system. And once you have that association, what actually happens then is that these two systems are co-activated. In other words, when you experience the particular visual pattern of visual stimuli, and therefore can activate the visual representation, this will automatically activate anything that is associated with it. In this case, the meaning. The meaning will be associated. That is a frog. So we can have a fairly safe definition of the mind, which I think is shared by many cognitive scientists, whether they differ on other scores in other respects, and the definition is namely that the mind is a network. It's a network of what? It's a network of systems. Each system is functionally specialized for a particular purpose, vision, audition, etc. And these systems interact. So it's a network of functionally specialized interacting systems. And we begin with sorting these things out in the modular cognition framework by talking about two rings to rule them all, and there is an outer ring which contains 5 perceptual systems. So what are these systems? So there are the 2 systems that we're dealing with of the 5, and that's the system which deals with acoustic input and the system that deals with visual input. That's to say the auditory system on the one hand and the visual system on the other. And then there is the inner circle, the inner sanctum as it were, where we have 6 cognitive systems which are at a further remove from the outside world. They don't deal with input from the outside, but they deal with input from each other and also from the outer ring. And the 6 systems are as follows. There's the spatial system, there is the motor system, the third one is the conceptual system, which I've already mentioned, and there's the affective system. And I will be dealing with 2 of these, but just to say that there are connections and interfaces between all of them, all interconnected. Although to keep things simple, I won't include all the interfaces because it makes the diagram a little complicated. Just deal with the ones we're interested in. So the inner systems 3 and 4 are the ones that I'm going to mention further, and I'm going to leave the other 2 aside for in fact for all of the present talk. The motor system of course is interesting for linguists because it deals with the articulation of language, but not only. Okay, so turning to the inner systems 5 and 6, some people would like these merged into one. That's fine by me, but I think we'll stick in the modular cognition framework with these 2, the syntactic system on the one hand and the phonological system on the other. And these are both systems that deal with linguistic structure of 2 types. The syntactic system deals with the syntactic representations, and the phonological system deals with phonological representations. I'll have a word about the word phonological in a second, but in any case the syntactic system has an interface with a conceptual system on the inner ring, so that means we can associate concepts with a particular syntactic structure, like a noun for example, and the phonological system, apart from being very closely related and connected to the syntactic system for obvious reasons, has links with the outer ring, namely the auditory system, and that shouldn't be a surprise since the word phonos in Greek means sound, and this enables us to associate generic sounds from the auditory system. Remember, the auditory system picks up acoustic input and it makes representations of any sound, whether it will have to do with language as we make our various associations, or whether it's something to do with something quite different, like a sound of an explosion or a tire squeaking or whatever. So this deals with all kinds of sound, but some of them can be associated with this system up here. However, we're stuck for the time being anyway with the word phonological, because it's has long been associated with speech, which is thought to be the primary way in which language is expressed. Because some people are not literate, they can't write, and of course we have language before we have learned to write anyway. But despite the word, it turns out that the phonological system can actually be used for other types of perceptual representation, and the one that is the obvious candidate is the visual system, which deals with language coming at us in the form of text, writing, but also in the form of sign language. And in fact, sign language experts, linguists, do talk about sign language phonology, despite the association with the word phonos. Okay. In principle, you could make language structure from any input on the outer ring, but it so happens our auditory and visual systems are developed developed in a way which is much more compatible with what we demand of language. Difficult to think of a language entirely expressed in smells, for example. Now we can look in detail. We've got the broader perspective of we're looking at the mind, and we're looking at the mind from a psychological point of view, not a neuroscientific point of view, and we're dealing with it in terms of the modular cognition framework, which gives us a further boost in coherence and detail. So let's look at the Spanish example. And I took the word problema, which is based on the notion of a problem, and the problem is a concept that we have to learn. So it's a conceptual construction that arrives in our heads at a certain point, and that is prior to anything else that can happen. And in our Spanish individual, this is of course connected with a noun representation. In fact, it's a complex representation including two features, the noun feature and the nominal feature masculine, which is a gender feature. And this gender feature is attached to noun, so this makes it a single complex representation, and that's associated with problem. So in the Spanish individual's mind, when that Spanish individual thinks of problem, activates the problem concept, this will be co-activated because it has been associated over the lifetime of that speaker as they have acquired a particular linguistic system, which we call Spanish. Okay, and that in this particular individual is also linked with a phonological structure, a phonological representation. There it is. I can't pronounce it because it's not pronounceable, because it's not a sound. It's an abstract structure. It's a linguistic structure, and there it is written in as it is in linguistics through between slashes. Okay. So this in turn has to be connected up with something else right on the outer ring. Before we do that, I want to make the point that so far, although we've got a connection between the meaning, between a linguistic structure in this system and a linguistic structure in that system, so far there's no indication of which language is involved. And why is that the case? It's the case because this pair of systems, I should say, is language neutral. It's blind to language. In other words, we can make languages as we understand them out of many languages, not just one. So this Spanish individual, if he or she is monolingual, will just have used it for sounds which are related to Spanish, but if this individual is a multilingual or bilingual, then those other systems, those other linguistic systems, will have been associated with linguistic structure using precisely the same pair of systems we have in this blind zone. So, in other words, there is no syntactic representation called Spanish or Afrikaans or whatever, and there is no phonological representation called Spanish. There's no label that can be attached to any of these structures. So these are completely language neutral. They have no idea of what languages they are handling. They just deal with what's on their plate, what's in their working memory, that means, and they sort them out in a coherent manner according to their own internal principles. So, in other words, we haven't really solved the question that we started off with. How does this Spanish individual know they are speaking or listening to Spanish? Well, that's the question I have here. Question number one, if linguistic structure is linguistic neutral, how then do we, or not just the Spanish individual or anyone, recognize something as Spanish? And we do so in the following manner. Firstly, of course, we have to have the language concept in our head to start off with, because it has the prior status I mentioned earlier. And we also have to have the concept of Spanish in our head. We also have to know what Spanish means, right? And this particular Spanish concept will be associated with lots of other things in our mind, and in the conceptual system in our mind. It'll be associated, of course, with food, with music, with culture, all kinds of things. And in addition to that, the language concept in the mind, especially the bilingual mind, will be associated with many other languages that we come to know of, or we come to be able to listen to and speak ourselves. So anyway, the point is that we need a language concept, and we need the Spanish concept, right? Then we have to connect that, have an association between that abstract speech subject structure and the sound problem. Remember, this is a system, the auditory system, that deals with any kinds of sound, whether they happen to be language sounds or not. This is also blind, by the way, to whatever language is involved, and it just processes sound and does its job. But at least we have to have a connection between that. So this now really represents the minimal set of associations we need for a single word, problema in Spanish, right? So when you hear the words problema on your Spanish speaker, these certainly have to be co-activated. But notice, so far we still haven't identified language. We don't know what this sound is. How do we know what this sound is? How do we know that this sound has something to do with language? Well, quite easy. We have to have built up an association between the sound and language. So of the many representations we have in the auditory system, this particular one can now be identified as having something to do with language, right? And it could be any language, of course, but we first have to make a connection with specifically the Spanish concept in order to identify the sound as belonging to the Spanish language. So that's how this association is made. We now have a way of associating the sound with not only language in general, but also a specific language. And the same story goes for the visual system, right? So for writing. So if we see the word problema written out, and we are one of these Spanish speakers, our hypothetical Spanish speaker in question will certainly recognize this particular visual pattern, not only as writing, but as certainly as language. But he will also associate, or she will associate it with Spanish. Right. So that set of associations simply replicates what we saw when we looked at the auditory system. What about sign language? I mentioned sign languages earlier on, and of course a sign language is not. There's no Spanish sign language. Sign language is a language in its own right. So here is an example of the British Sign Language, not a Spanish sign language. I could have chosen that. A language that happens to be used in Spain, but is not Spanish. Here we have the British Sign Language, and that is used as you might imagine, in the British Isles. And again, the set of associations is the same. Of course, we have to have the concept of British Sign Language in our heads to be able to make the association, but there we do have it in this example, and this really then again replicates the same story for that we had for text and for sound. So in other words, what this amounts to is that different languages, like the concept of language itself in fact, are identified ultimately by their physical manifestations. So not in the linguistic structural systems, which are blind and language neutral, but by an association between the meaning in the conceptual system and various physical manifestations, be it a visual in terms of writing or sign language, or auditory in the case of speech. So that really answers the basic question within the terms of the modular cognition framework to the question we posed at the beginning of this representation. So, to sum up, language processing is neutral. You can create linguistic systems without any idea of what language is, or what languages are, or how individual languages are, simply by being exposed to the appropriate input. But to put a label on them, to find meaning in them, and to say that one thing is an example of language and not general sound, or that it's an example of Spanish rather than Afrikaans, then you need these perceptual representations to have an association with the conceptual system. You have to have a meaning association with one or other of these perceptual representations. So the second question goes back to the little mention I had of the ideological view in a sociocultural perspective. Why does the language concept get treated by some people as toxic? Well, there are many answers to this question, but in terms of sticking with psychology and sticking with the modular cognition framework, the answer is that there is an association between the notion of language and a negative concept, a negative representation in the affective system. So this doesn't explain how the person got to that idea, but that explains how they have it in their heads, and immediately they think of language, they think of it as something negative, and to put a further label on it, a further meaning, namely that it is neo-colonialist. They have to have this concept in their heads, they have to acquire this during their lifetime, and they also have to have a negative association with neo-colonialist. So looking into the mind of someone who has this point of view, this is what we will find. So what could we say about that? Well, the negative value judgment that some sociocultural researchers place on the language concept, claiming that language and languages have been somehow weaponized and are oppressive, this seems to me personally that it's a criticism less of the concept itself and more about how that concept has been exploited. And so looking at it from a modular cognition point of view, when I can ask, is there a possibility of having a positive association? Could a language be used in positive ways, in which case you would have a link between the concept of language and the positive value and not the negative value. And with that closing reflection, I would like to end this talk. Thank you very much.